When we observe the literature of different nations, we see that apart from the contemporary topics, most of the important writers of all religions and nations, they talk about two things, that is the problem of birth and death, and what is there beyond death, that is immortality. And depending on one's religion and faith, different writers come up with different conclusions. So you see elegies written by writers when their near and dear die. There is so much philosophy, introspection and speculation going into this problem of death and immortality, which is the unsolved puzzle, because even till date we do not know what happens, why a person dies, when he dies, what happens to that so-called life within, where it goes. So this is a constant problem which teases humanity and which is a constant source of inspiration for many writers. So it is the unending source for literature and philosophy. And if we look into the literature of England or English, you see that there are many writers. Shakespeare, for example, you have read the sonnets of Shakespeare, and there he challenges death, he challenges time in his sonnets. And in his famous play Hamlet, he has the question, to be or not to be. What is the meaning of to be or not to be? Whether to live or die, and what happens when one dies? To die, to sleep. To sleep is perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death and dreams, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. So he says, if death and sleep are one, there are many dreams we get when we sleep. And what are the dreams we are going to get after we die if it is a prolonged sleep? Is it going to be pleasant? So these are the questions which tease and which make us think what life beyond death would be. If Hamlet himself has such problems, there is a contemporary of Shakespeare, the metaphysical poet John Donne. He challenges death because he has faith in the life beyond. So he personifies death, calls death by his name. Death, be not proud, don't think you can conquer me. So he writes a poem, death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, but that's not the truth. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not. And similarly, there is nothing you can do to me. So depending on his faith, John Donne says that death is nothing but a mediator between this life and the life after. And there are other writers in your American literature. Walt Whitman, for example, in his poetry, he calls death by so many beautiful names. He eulogizes death and he says that is the most beautiful word, death, 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 death. And he calls it the word final, superior to all, because all experiences in life and the progress of life, the journey of life leads to that final goal. And he says it is stronger and more delicious than any. He calls her lovely and soothing death. You have read Leaves of Grass, Out to the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, and for the other poem, the Elegy, Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. Here he calls death as the sweet mother, the dark mother, and the strong deliveress. So these are the opinions of Walt Whitman, who is also a transcendentalist. And when we come to another American poet, Wallace Stevens, he calls death as the mother of beauty. Death is the mother of beauty, hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and desires. So whether it is the 16th century writer or a 20th century poet, all of them talk of one thing, death, and depending on their understanding of life, they give an interpretation to death. And when it comes to the post-war writers, because they don't believe in immortality, because they think that there is no religion, no God, their poetry is full of disappointment and disillusionment. Today now, we are going to talk how Emily Dickinson, a transcendentalist, an 18th century writer, wrote about death and immortality and how her writings are special. Emily Dickinson, she lived for a short period from 1830 to 1886, and you know, she led the life of a recluse. She remained alone and she is a hermit by deliberate and conscious choice. She decided to lead such a life, and this life gave her a better opportunity for introspection. And this is one of the qualities which you see all the writings are based on her experiences of the outside world or her experiences on abstract ideas like death and immortality. I use the word experience. You may wonder how a person alive can experience death, because in Emily Dickinson, like in John Donne, there is no difference between thought and emotion. According to some of the important critics, she has fused thought and emotion, and whatever she thinks is close to her personal experience. She is a writer of special qualities because she never came out of her house for the last 30 years of her life, and most of the poems which she wrote from this home. This is Miss Emily Dickinson's home in Amherst, Massachusetts, United States, and in this home, which was her residence all through her life, she spent her life sitting near a window and observing the world outside like a pageant, and in the walks she had, observing nature, observing everybody, and from her letters and her poems, she wrote a number of poems. We know what kind of a person she is and why she is called to be a perfect flower of American transcendentalism. The perfect flower of American transcendentalism or New England transcendentalism, because she had the qualities of both the Puritan thought or faith in God and at the same time the ability to think freely, which is a quality of the transcendentalist. She transcended the qualities of Puritanism, you can say, because her concept of God is somehow different from the Puritan faith, where God is a disciplinarian and a dictator. She refused such a concept of God, and because she believed in immortality and in the Bible, most of her poems, which she wrote in her solitude and were published after her death, show how this was a constant topic in all her poems. So she wrote about 1775 poems on various themes, but of all the themes, the theme of death, immortality, heaven, God or life beyond, call it whatever, this was something which inspired her and made her poems the most lyrical. So death and immortality are the main subjects of her poetry, and today we are going to see how she is very special in writing about these. In one of her letters to her friends, she says that bareheaded life under grass worries one like a wasp. What is the meaning of worrying somebody like a wasp? Means it goes on haunting you, means you can never forget that death is inevitable and that everyone who is born, everyone who is a mortal has to die someday. It worries you like a wasp, she writes to her friend, and it really did worry her. Most of us may forget that we are all going to die, but here is a writer who hasn't forgotten that death is inevitable, and her concept of death is somehow different from John Donne's and the questioning of Hamlet or Shakespeare or other writers. She feels that there is nothing to be worried about death, and her poems show that quality. Her poems show a perfect fusion of sensibility and thought, because as I said, she experiences death while she is alive. She tries to imagine the process of dying, what life would be beyond. So she is a graveyard poet. She writes constantly of death and the beyond. She has a morbid concern for her personal revelation. So most of her poems, they are in the first person. She talks in by calling I am dying, I am going to the graveyard, death is my companion. So there is a personal revelation in all her poems. And what does she do? She writes in a dramatic way, like the metaphysical poet John Donne once again, because Alan Tate, he sees a similarity between Emily Dickinson and John Donne. Most of both these writers, they have the ability to fuse thought and experience. We generally think with our mind and feel with our heart, but for her there is no such distinction. She thinks and feels simultaneously, so it is difficult for us to see where her thought ends and where her feeling begins, and she writes dramatically with live locutions. So she talks directly to us. Either it is the description of death or nature, whatever it is, she talks to the readers. So what all she hasn't done in her real life by remaining a recluse, remaining like a hermit, she satisfies by talking directly to us. The voice speaks to us. It's not a soliloquy or a person talking to herself. It is a person addressing the readers of generations. That's what MacLeish says when he says, she speaks to the readers of the things which every living creature knows, and the voice is very clear, and you can't escape or you can't ignore the voice which addresses us and talks of most of the problems which all of us face in our day-to-day life, along with the fear of death, which is always lurking. And as more and more people in our contemporary society face any problems, immediately we ourselves also question ourselves, what is this death? Is it a pleasant thing or is it an unpleasant one? And her experience and observation of life and death is going to be one of the topics. Her ideas on death, her faith in immortality, her concept of God, and her description of heaven. I am limiting this lecture to these few points on death because of the 1775 poems, she has written almost 50% of the poems on these topics, and to get a clear picture of what she talks of death, the kind of vocabulary she has used, you have to read the poems of Emily Dickinson to appreciate her ability to bring distant ideas, abstract ideas into concrete observation by using far related images to bring the idea close to us. So, let us see what she talks of death, experience and observation of death. I am telling you an experience because you are going to see here, this is the real grave of the poet after she dies, and into this grave she has gone a number of times before really entering it. In this poem, she says, the sun kept setting, setting still, so life goes on. My feet kept drowsing, drowsing still. So, as life departs from the body, what would be the response of the person as each and every organ stops its sensation, getting more and more numb, she describes here, and then finally she says, it's dying I am doing. So, she says, this process which I am now describing is the process of dying, but I am not afraid to know dying. So, she says she knows what dying is, and she declares that she is not afraid to die. And along with this poem, I would like to remind you of the famous poem which is already there prescribed in your syllabus, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And in this poem, she very happily describes the journey of a person to the cemetery and says, life doesn't end there. The heads of the horses, the chariot is directed to eternity, and that she knew it after going there. And death is a chivalrous gentleman who accompanies her while she is going into the eternal life of immortality. So, if the word great means anything in poetry, this poem is one of the greatest in the English language according to Alan Tate. He says that she has done a wonderful job by synchronizing and bringing together many of the images of life with the concept of death. And there is another critic who praises this poem. Let us see what he says. It's a poem of departure from life, an intensely conscious leave taking. Means she is very conscious of what she is leaving behind. You see her describing the childhood in the school, the middle age, the old age, all these they are not described in detail. She gives us just some suggestions through the images which come one after the other before she enters the cemetery. And after this intensely conscious leave taking, she ends the poem without a final statement on what is beyond, according to Winters, who is another important critic on Emily Dickinson. But these two poems are just samples of what she describes as her experience and observation of death, because she not only described her own death, she describes the death of her friend, how she observes the change in the body, the change in the behavior of the people around. So, her poems are full of this concept of death. And now coming to the personality of death, is she afraid of death? Does she think that death is a cruel man? Shakespeare always uses the image of the scythe and the cruel death, the changes which are brought about in love and other things. Keats and other romantics also talk of death as if it is bringing a disturbance into the happiness of life. But here she welcomes death, and she writes that death is always very civil and gentle in his behavior. And there is a beautiful full-length poem on her description of death, where she says, death is the only thing you cannot find out all about, because you don't know who his parents are, where he is, how he spent his childhood. And she describes further the qualities of death. She calls death industrious, laconic, punctual, because he never misses his time, and he is sedate, he is very calm, bold as a brigand, because he knows what to rob from where, and builds like a bird too. He builds so many nests. The nests which death builds are the graveyards. She compares these graveyards to rooms, to nests, and many such similar observations from her day-to-day life. And there is a final twist to this poem, where she says, after all this is done by death so carefully, there is one thief. Who is that? Christ. Christ robs the nest. Robin after robin smuggled to rest. So, while death does the industry or labor of taking everyone from life and preserving them like a bird in its nest, Christ robs each and every creature or each and every soul which is put to rest to the eternal kingdom. So, Christ is the robber who robs the nest into which death has brought each and every creature. So, the personality of death holds no fear for Emily Dickinson, and there are some other points also which you should remember while appreciating her poem. Her faith in immortality is responsible for her fearlessness. It stems from her confidence that death is only a temporary door or a stopping phase from which one continues into the eternal life, which is going to be very happy. So, she is confident, like John Donne, that death cannot be proud of his conquer. She says, no rack can torture me, my soul is at liberty. She is confident that her soul cannot be held back by death. Behind this mortal bone there knits a bolder one. Such confidence in immortality is the reason why she welcomes death and constantly thinks of death, because after this impermanent or mortal life, she is going to go into a world of permanence and permanent joy. So, there is a poem which is prescribed to you also, where she describes death as a person who tries to hold back spirit. Death is a dialogue between the spirit and the dust, and the spirit very boldly says that there is a higher responsibility for him, and while death tries to hold back, he leaves the mortal coil which is just made of clay and flies back to heaven. So, death is a temporary experience which can be enjoyed because it is not permanent, and you go into the world of eternal life or immortality, and her faith in God is behind this faith in immortality. Her concept of God differs from the Puritan concept, but you see why it is so. She says God, she addresses God in most of her poems as an earl, a Moor, a person who shows authority, and in the poem on death she calls Christ as a robber who smuggles the souls to rest. He is a burglar, a banker who maintains an account of what people have done, because the Puritan concept is that God has to show mercy on you. The Calvinistic theory is that you cannot achieve immortality or salvation through what you do. It is God's mercy alone that does it, and this is against her free thinking, which says that depending on your reasoning, your logic, you can transcend what these principles of Puritan faith tell in the Bible. And she calls God somewhere as the Father. So, depending on her mood, she wrote a number of poems, and I never spoke with God nor visited in heaven, yet certain am I of the spot as if the checks were given. What are these checks? Checks means ticket, means your journey is almost confirmed, you have the ticket in your hand. So, she feels certain that there is a God in heaven who is going to receive her after death. Her faith in God is one thing, and her mockery of the Puritan concept is another thing. She did not accept the concept of a Puritan God. So, she prefers the process of going to paradise in her own way to following the tenets of going to church, listening to the sermons, and feeling that paradise is something where there is no change. So, in one of the poems prescribed to you also, she says she prefers to stay on earth and enjoy her life, observe the birds and experience nature rather than go to church and listen to the dull sermons. So, this shows only her criticism of the Puritan concept, but not her faith in immortality or God. She objects to the Puritan concept. The Maker's cordial visage, however good to see, is shunned. We must admit it like an adversity. So, in this poem, Drowning, she says that God, we all respect God, but in case God were to come and appear before us, or if there is a chance for us to see God immediately, we would be afraid because he is a disciplinarian, he is a strict man, and such God would be someone whom we wouldn't like to see. So, her concept of God, her concept of immortality, her fear or fearlessness of death, everything you can see in the poems which she describes. Though she hasn't talked to us directly, we can understand her concept of death and immortality by reading her poems. And heaven is something, she says, which is unreachable, something which is to be imagined, an abstract idea, but once you realize an abstract idea, it becomes concrete and the joy, the thrill is lost. So, her concept of heaven is, it is something which is beyond reach, and in some of her poems she says the sweetness of the object of her desire increases in proportion to their remoteness. So, if you think that there is something very thrilling and wonderful, the attempts you make to reach it are very thrilling, but once you go, even if it were to be climbing Everest, you go and set foot on that mount, that means it is already achieved, and there should be something more thrilling to be achieved. That is the urge which drives man, and she says that heaven is such an abstract idea, and why all of us are thrilled because of it is because it is unreachable. Did the harebell lose her girdle to the lover bee? This is a beautiful poem in which she says a maiden is attractive only as long as she maintains her chastity, just as a beautiful flower is attractive only as long as she does not give in to the temptation of offering itself to a lover bee. And similarly, heaven and God also are attractive only because we cannot understand them. Once they become clear, the thrill is lost. That is what she explains in this poem. It is a lengthy poem, so I have just given you the beginning quotation here. She says that heaven and God will lose their present status if understood clearly. So, something that is teasing, something which is beyond our reach is something which attracts us all the time. So, heaven is something unreachable, and that is the reason why it is luring and puzzling and teasing. So is death, so is heaven. Her poems are the distilled essence of her meditations, because she has meditated, she has thought on these topics, and whatever life, nature and her observations have given her, she has distilled them. By distillation, what you do is you give the pure essence like a fragrance. So, all her poems are very brief in length, they are lyrical in their quality, and they give you the extract or the essence of her observations on nature, and through nature, through her observations about these concepts which she tells to the readers. And many people consider her to be eccentric. They think that she is abnormal. There could be some reasons for her leading a life of a recluse, a hermit, not talking even to her friends, trying to even feed the birds by sending a basket with some breadcrumbs, but not coming down to feed them. So, she is eccentric, but her eccentricity, her loneliness and depression are revealed in her poetry not as personal experiences, but they are elevated to a subtler level where she gives her observations of real life and many of the concepts which all of us also feel that riddle us, that cause some problems to our understanding. And you see that all her poems are very brief. They don't run into pages. They stop short of a page or even less. The reason is she concentrates, condenses the thought and makes them very brief. They are not grammatically correct, most of her poems, and some critics feel that she doesn't know the rules of poetry, she doesn't know the rules of grammar, but that's not true. For when we read her letters, we see that she knows the rules of grammar perfectly well. In her poems, she intentionally changed the rules of syntax and grammar, defied the rules of writing poetry, just as she defied the rules of leading a life. So, she is a free thinker and a writer who experimented with grammar, syntax and vocabulary. She experimented with a number of words. When we look into the collection of her poems and her writings, we see that before choosing a particular word for a particular poem, she has experimented and seen how the word suits there. So, she is not a writer who just wrote offhand. She had all the time in the world to make the necessary changes, and her poems show that whatever she has done it consciously. If we fail to understand the meaning, it only means that we should read it another time and yet another time. Her poems, though short, call for a number of readings before we understand them, as she intended them for us to be read. So, condensation of thought and language, spontaneity and boldness of approach make the readers think. We have to think of the content, the style, and her mastery of both the content and style in expressing these puzzling thoughts in such a beautiful way.